All right, let's get going. Thanks everyone for joining and welcome to our monthly webinar series for the National Park Service's Connected Conservation Initiative. This is Brian Fainer and I'm with the Park Service and help support the effort. As most of you know, our Connected Conservation webinars focus on how NPS staff and partners can use various tools and strategies to conserve NPS resources at the landscape and seascape level. We host a webinar at least once a month, and you can find recordings of past webinars in our internal Park Service Connected Conservation Toolkit, which is accessible to all Department of Interior employees and also the Network for Landscape Conservation website. And that's the place to go for non-NPS folks. The webinar series is open to other feds, NGOs, and partners. And as such, please feel free to forward our webinar announcements for future webinars to others who may find them useful. In the chat box in the bottom right of your screen, you'll see, again, links to our internal toolkit and the Landscape Network for Landscape Conservation website. Also on the right tab, you'll see a questions tab, and that is the place to go to plug in questions throughout the presentation. Following the presentation, we'll review those questions, and we'll facilitate a Q&A for our presenter with those that are submitted. And so today's presenter is Jeff Hunter, who is the Senior Program Manager for the National Parks Conservation Association. Jeff is based in Asheville, North Carolina, and works to conserve the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Blue Ridge Parkway, and Appalachian National Scenic Trail. Prior to joining NPCA in 2015, Jeff worked on sage grouse issues in the high desert landscape in eastern California. In his spare time, Jeff can be found hiking and birding with his wife, Cara. With that, Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your busy day to join me to learn about this project. And I'm going to talk for 25 minutes, maybe half an hour, and then hopefully we'll have some questions. If there's something I don't touch on in my presentation, I encourage the attendees to certainly drill down and ask any questions. So great, let's get going. So I do work for National Parks Conservation Association. For those of you not familiar, this is a non-governmental organization. We are a National Parks advocacy organization celebrating our centennial this year. We were founded in 1919 by the first director of the National Park Service, Stephen Mather, who saw the need for an outside advocacy group to speak up for the new park system within 3 years of the park system's establishment. And so I'm based in our Asheville field office in Asheville, North Carolina. We do have 28 offices around the country, and we're headquartered in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to advocate to protect and enhance America's national parks for present and future generations. And so I'm going to be talking about one way we implement our mission here in southern Appalachia. Okay. So while I'm going to be talking a little bit about NPCA, let me be really clear right from the start that this is a collaborative project. This is not the kind of project that NPCA can accomplish on our own. This is a very large, multi-jurisdictional landscape. So partnership with federal, state, tribal, and non-governmental organizations is absolutely essential for success. And what you see here on this slide is just a sampling of organizations that are involved in this. And in particular, the last time we gathered was in late October in Maggie Valley, North Carolina, when the Federal Highways Administration came down and facilitated a 2-day wildlife crossing workshop. And that was the Ecological Division of Federal Highways Administration. I'll talk a little bit more about them as we go along. But you can see this is a pretty neat group of folks. And the nature of this collaboration is pretty neat. I would encourage any questions about how we got this together. I'm not going to go into that in great detail today. I will talk about our timeline, but next. So this is the landscape we're looking at. This is a fairly simple map. You can see the blue on the left-hand side of the map is Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And Great Smoky Mountains National Park is approximately 522,000 acres, give or take. The red line through the middle of the map is Interstate 40, and this is an interstate highway that goes from all the way across North Carolina, and it goes, in fact, to Barstow, California. So it's a very long east-west highway. The project area is actually a steep, rugged gorge that follows the Pigeon River. We call this area the Pigeon River Gorge. And because of the topography, the orientation of the road, for the most part, is north-south. And the landscape we're looking at is 28 miles of Interstate 40 corridor, 20 miles in North Carolina from the Maggie Valley exit to the Tennessee state line, and then from the Tennessee state line to where the Foothills Parkway, which is part of the national park system, ties in to I-40 at about mile marker 443. So most of the area, 20 miles, is in North Carolina, 8 miles in Tennessee. But again, you see there are 2 wildlife agencies, 2 DOTs. We have national forests in Tennessee and North Carolina, the Park Service, the Forest Service, lots of folks involved. And so here is charismatic megafauna that's representative of the area. This is our American black bear. This photograph was taken with a camera trap. Actually, I-40 eastbound in our project area goes through 2 tunnels. And what we call the eastbound partial land bridge, this camera was set on top of one of the tunnels. If you drew a line down from this bear, you'd probably end up right in the middle of I-40. So the road is actually running under this bear right here. And so this animal was photographed in June of 2018. This 16-second video is going to show you pretty quickly both the public safety issues and the issues for wildlife. It was photographed in August of 2018 by Susan Detweiler. She just happened to be driving the corridor on a Sunday afternoon at 2:30, and traffic was at a full standstill on I-40. Let's take a look. Now notice westbound traffic is completely stopped. So this female and 2 cubs went, and here comes the straggler. There's 1 in every group. So that shows you very clearly what the issue is. And we have significant black bear mortality in this corridor. And we also have another critter on the landscape that we're concerned about and we're trying to be proactive about. And I'll go into that. So here you see the consequence of a lot of the crossing attempts. What we have right here is a concrete barrier. The concrete barrier where that video was shot was fairly low, but in many parts of our project area, that barrier is 5 to 6 feet high. That's a death trap for cubs. Adult bears can often get over, but cubs just can't, and they end up in the road, adults separated from young, and this is often the consequence. And this is what we're trying to address with our project. So I-40 in the Pigeon River Gorge was opened in 1968, just 51 years ago. Now, needless to say, the wildlife in this area did not evolve with an interstate highway cutting across their habitat. When the roadway was opened in 1968, this critter, elk, had been long extirpated from the landscape. In 2001, 2002, elk were reintroduced to Great Smoky Mountains National Park after a more than 200-year absence. The herd is growing. The herd is now on both sides of the interstate. They've expanded beyond park boundaries. And so I believe I know of 3 elk that have been hit on I-40 and killed. It's not a huge issue right now, but we're trying to get in front of it before it is. And this is often the consequence. Now, I'm focusing today on Interstate 40. We are also working collaboratively looking at US 19, the federal highway between Maggie Valley, North Carolina, and Cherokee, North Carolina. We do have a good bit of elk mortality in that area, and that's where this animal was hit and killed. This is a concern to the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, one of the stakeholders, because their tribal members are disproportionately impacted by wildlife vehicle collisions and conflict with elk because the majority of the animals are in that part of the park. And that's actually where the Blue Ridge Parkway, America's second most visited national park unit, ties into Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the most visited national park in the system. So here's a timeline that shows you a little bit about the origin of this project. We brought this up to the park superintendent and their leadership staff in March of 2016 as an issue. In July of 2016, the Forest Service announced a timber sale called the 12 Mile Project that ostensibly was to expand elk habitat on both sides of the highway. And so myself and a number of other collaborators attended the public meetings and said, you really need to think about how the elk might respond to this because we don't want them in the road. Fast forwarding a little bit, I pulled the stakeholders together in February 2017. And when I say the stakeholders, we did not have the Department of Transportation at the meeting. I wanted to see if the land managers, the wildlife folks, the NGOs thought this was a project that warranted some collaboration. And in fact, that was the case. A couple other milestones. In September 2017, we brought consultant Tony Clevenger from the Western Transportation Institute down to help lead field trips and to speak to all the stakeholders. I'll show you a little bit about that. And then most recently, as I mentioned in October, we had a federal highways crossing workshop. So really, since the stakeholders got together for the first time, we're just over 2 years for this project. So it's still fairly young. This is a photograph from the Ecological Wildlife Crossing Workshop in Maggie Valley. This is one of 5 breakout groups that occurred at the end of the second day. The gentleman on the left is Joe Clark. He's a research biologist with the USGS. He's at the University of Tennessee. We had scientists, we had NGO folks, we had fish and wildlife folks, lots of folks coming together in good faith, looking for solutions. It was a really empowering. We had 65 people in the room, so very grateful for Federal Highways coming down and expending those resources for us. Let's look at the project area itself, and this is a really interesting area. So this is I-40 where it goes through the mountain with a double tunnel. Where my cursor is I-40 west moving towards Knoxville, and over here is I-40 east going towards Asheville. And this is a land bridge over a double tunnel. What we have here is a service road. It's not traveled very much. And so bear researcher Mike Pelton had told us that he had evidence in the 80s of bear using this land bridge to safely get across the road. In September of 2016, I went up on the land bridge and there was wildlife sign everywhere, trails, scat. So it was quite obvious that bear were there. We haven't seen any evidence of elk using this crossing yet, but we're interested to see as the herd expands if they will try. This is a group of stakeholders in September of 2017 gathered on that service road by the double tunnel that you could see from up above, and we have folks from North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Wilderness Society. There's researcher Mike Pelton, Tennessee Department of Transportation, U.S. Forest Service. Here's Tony Clevenger with a white and red hat. Just a really diverse group of folks who are interested in seeing if we can improve this situation for wildlife and for motorists as well. And this is the beneficiary of our work. This is an adult and a cub. The cub is the one looking at the camera. And this photograph was taken on that land bridge. This was in November of 2017. Some of the other wildlife that are using this land bridge to safely get across the road. We have Bobcat. This beautiful Bobcat actually has snow on its head on a 0-degree day, January 4th of last year. And this chupacabra, actually it's a melanistic coyote, a little bit mangy, but you don't see all that all that often. And in fact, if you zoom in on this picture, this animal's pelt is covered in blood. It had obviously just killed or fed on something. Let's look at a couple of the interchanges. This is Waterville Road. It's in Tennessee, just across the state line. What's significant about Waterville Road is the Appalachian National Scenic Trail comes out of the park into the forest and crosses under Interstate 40 here. Early on, we had whitewater rafting guides who run the Pigeon River here tell us that they'd see elk on one side of the highway one day and the other side of the highway the next day, and they weren't sure how she was crossing. We had anecdotal reports of guides seeing elk walking across this bridge here, of elk along the riverbank here, and elk grazing underneath the interchange. So that was all interesting information. This is one of the locations that the stakeholders gathered to look at the situation, and that's the beauty of bringing someone like a Tony Clevenger down who has consulted and worked on wildlife mitigation projects all over the world. This is a cow elk on the shoulder of I-40. This is in Tennessee and near Hartford, Tennessee. And this photo was taken by a whitewater rafting guide. And this is an animal that was seen on one side of the road one day, one side of the road the next day. And this behavior, it catalyzed a partnership between partners Wildlands Network, the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, and the National Park Service and my organization to collar elk to see if we can get some data from collars and actually determine what's she doing, how is she crossing? Is she crossing at the interchange? Is she going across the pavement at grade? So she was subsequently collared. And we got some really interesting information from that. Here's Dr. Liz Hillard from Wildlands Network, one of our key collaborators, and Steve Goodman. He's a field biologist who works for me in the Cataloochee Valley, collaring a bull elk. Steve was out yesterday morning. I'm not sure if Liz was with him, but they're partners and work hand in hand. And they collared a cow yesterday morning. So the collaring continues. The cow I showed you a short time ago, we found some really interesting information. First of all, she did cross at grade in the middle of the night. She went right across the pavement. The only reason she's still alive is because she did go in the middle of the night. She has crossed I-40 at grade at least 3 or 4 times that I'm aware of. And then interestingly, she came back just where the Appalachian Trail crosses, just like a hiker, and went under the interchange at Waterville Road. But you can see she's really hanging around close to the highway, and that's a concern, obviously. Another one of our intersections is Harmon Den in North Carolina. And one of the interesting things here, in 2015, a collared elk crossed under I-40 and moved to the other side of the highway from the national park. Here's Max Patch, and that's an iconic southern Appalachian ball that the Appalachian Trail crosses, and they hang around in this area. Since this cow crossed in 2015, a small subherd has been growing on that side of the highway. And again, that's a concern because now they're on both sides of the road and expanding, colonizing new habitat and presenting challenges, safety challenges for motorists. And here are the stakeholders gathered at this interchange. Tony was talking about when this bridge is eventually replaced, some measures that could be taken to improve wildlife's ability to safely cross here. This is Ron Sutherland here in the corner with Wildlands Network. He's a scientist and very involved in this project and very grateful for his assistance. Here's Liz with North Carolina Wildlife Federation and others. Really want to point out again and again our partners because we couldn't do this kind of work without them. This is that eastbound land bridge I talked about earlier, the first black bear I showed you. You can see the eastbound tunnel running through the mountain. That bear was photographed right here. We do seem to have some mortality hotspots in this area, and that's something that Liz and Steve, our biologists, are working on to try to discern where are our mortality hotspots. The mortality data had been scattered across various agencies. They're collecting it, gathering it together, cleaning it up, and trying to improve collection methods so we can actually see where are animals getting hit and killed, and is there some discernible pattern that might lead us to some solutions on the ground. And that might be improving existing crossings, building new underpasses or overpasses. And here is the westbound lane adjacent to that camera where the eastbound lane goes to the tunnel, so you can get an idea. One of the things our road ecologist consultants told us was that if this was a hotspot, this is an interesting area because instead of having to build perhaps an overpass over 4 lanes, because the eastbound lane is tunneled through the mountain, you could potentially just bridge the westbound lane here and create an opportunity for wildlife to safely cross. This is an intern, Brian Wirtz. He recently graduated from Warren Wilson College, and he's deploying a wildlife camera in Forest Service lands directly adjacent to I-40. This is something we were doing early on just to try to gather data on wildlife movements. And we certainly saw quite a bit of wildlife crossing right here directly next to the road. This is one of our stakeholders. This is Kim Delozier with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. And Kim and I are hovered over a map on the hood of his truck. Some of you may know Kim if you work for the Park Service. He retired as a supervisory wildlife biologist in the Smokies, I believe in 2011, give or take a year. And shortly after he retired, he was hired by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. Kim helped oversee the reintroduction of elk in the park, so the Elk Foundation wanted to bring his expertise on board, and we're working with him. On this day, we were deploying some wildlife cameras in some Park Service property adjacent to private lands. Kim had a relationship with some of the private landowners, and so we headed from here up to a property. This is some of the data that we gathered from the cameras that were deployed on that day. We found a cow and a calf elk within about a mile of I-40. This was the first evidence in this area of camera trapping that we could see there were some travel corridors that brought wildlife close to the highway. So this is a tract of land that Kim and I and several other folks got up to deploy cameras. This was privately owned. It still is privately owned, in fact, the Stevens Creek Tract. The land over here on the right-hand side, forested land, is National Park Service property. And when we got up here, this 147-acre tract was for sale. There was some talk about a private buyer coming in and putting in a hunting concession here on the boundary of the park. Myself and Kim and a few other partners referred this to the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy, and this tract has since been acquired by that land trust and will be kept open. And when I say open, in meadow, which is vitally important for elk. Most of our landscape is forested, so this is super important elk habitat. This shows the value of involving land trusts in work like this. This shows you that tract of land. Interestingly enough, this little green, what I call a pigtail, is a right-of-way that comes almost down to I-40 here. And this land was acquired and brought into public ownership in the late 60s because the Park Service wanted to build an entrance to the Cataloochee Valley through this area. Local opposition shut that down. The land remains in public ownership and is used as a travel corridor by bear, elk, over a wide variety of wildlife. This is the Stevens Creek Tract that was acquired as a result of stakeholders working together. This is our Volgenau Wildlife Fellow, Steve Goodman. The Volgenau Foundation has given us support for this project, and in recognition of Dr. Volgenau's largesse, we have named Steve after the foundation. Steve comes to us from Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, where he worked on red cockaded woodpecker issues and gopher tortoise, and he's on the ground researching mortality hotspots, deploying some wildlife cameras strategically, and working on collar projects with our federal and state partners. One of the things we're trying to discern is, are wildlife using some of the existing structures that we have? For instance, this Forest Service Road box culvert on the North Carolina side of the highway. We're trying to see, are elk, bear, other critters actually using a structure like this? So that's some of the research that Steve is conducting in partnership with Liz from the Wildlands Network. We have another tract of land that may be acquired soon. This is the Wilkins Creek Tract. It has 1 mile of highway frontage on Interstate 40. It's up for sale, and it would be a key tract There's early successional habitat here. The area was logged pretty heavily about 15 years ago, so we don't have much hard mast or acorns or hickory trees in here. They were cut, but we do have quite a bit of blueberry, huckleberry, and other soft mast, blackberry. But this tract is adjacent to Forest Service land. So hopefully this will be acquired. One of the interesting aspects of this tract is it spans the interstate. So if you're working in an area to do some mitigation with possible underpasses or overpasses, you need to have a land trust working with you to make sure land on both sides of where you might want to put a structure in is protected. I want to be clear, I'm not saying that this is an area where a structure will be built. We don't know if or where structures will be built. We're trying to follow the science. And hopefully we'll have some answers in a year, possibly two. So I just want to recognize some folks at the conclusion of this. First of all, our partners at the National Park Service, Bill Stiver, we're working closely with him and his staff. The North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, Colleen Olfen-Butel, the black bear biologist, and lots of folks from there. The Delozier Foundation, the Standback family has provided funding for this project, not only to us, but to other partners, Fred and Alice Standback and Brad and Shelley Standback. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation has also provided us some funding. Our consultants, Tony Clevenger and Marcel Hauser, have been invaluable. Dr. Mike Pelton's research in the past has been super helpful. We were able to bring down some international help in the form of Terry McGuire. He's a highway engineer who worked on the Banff overpasses in Alberta, Canada, and Banff National Park. And then, of course, Federal Highways Administration ecological staff have been super helpful. And then just finally, a shout out to all our collaborators and partners. There are many of them, and we couldn't do this work without them. So that's all I have, Brian. Do we want to open it up for some questions?
Yeah, let's do that. Jeff, thank you for a great presentation. Awesome work and awesome coalition of partners, as you can see there, obviously. Again, folks, if you have questions for Jeff, go ahead and type it into the questions tab on that little interface bar on the right hand of your screen. I'll read those questions to Jeff as I receive them, but let me sneak in a quick question here. It sounds like this is really a process, right? At this point, trying to collect the information that's out there on the movement of wildlife. What's your sense for, again, kind of the next steps, working with your partners and kind of figuring out and prioritizing, you know, what tools could be employed, you know, and what's the time horizon for that? I mean,
sure.
It sounds like again, it's a kind of information collection right now, but I mean, overpasses, signs, like what's your sense right now where things are heading?
Sure. Well, let me be clear. When you have a project like this with so many different stakeholders, you know, it's taken us this much time just to learn about each organization's priorities, our decision-making processes, to build trust and good faith. So that, you know, we've been laying that groundwork, and I think we've been pretty successful. Certainly our workshop in October seemed to indicate that. We are in a data gathering phase right now. You know, I wouldn't want to speculate when we might, you know, build some new structures. I think one of the first things we have talked about as a collaborative group is if we can identify some low-hanging fruit, some opportunities to improve the functioning of existing structures. For instance, that box culvert that I showed in one of the slides with some fencing. That's something we'd like to do because that's not nearly as expensive as building new structures. But again, we need to follow the science, and we're in a data gathering mode. We're thinking that by the end of this year, we should have a pretty good hotspot map developed. But one thing I want to emphasize is mortality is not, it's not something that's steady and constant. When we have a failure with our acorn crop, a mast failure, which happens periodically, and it happens sporadically across the landscape this year, you tend to see real spikes in mortality. acorns are vitally important food for black bears, and so in the fall, they're finding, that's what they're doing all day long. So they're looking for acorns, they're eating acorns, they're fattening up, and if they can't find them readily, they have to cross roads. They're moving a lot more, and you tend to see spikes in mortality. So that's one of the challenges we have. You know, during our data gathering, easy for me to say or not so, during our data gathering phase, if we don't have any issues with the acorn crops, we may not see a whole lot of mortality. So I hope that answers your question. If you want to shoot me a follow-up, please do.
Yeah, that's great. Here's an interesting question we got. What can members of the public and communities in the area do to help get these corridors built throughout throughout the area?
Sure. So each one of the state departments of transportation, when they improve a road or build a new road, these projects go out for public comment. So what I would encourage folks to do is to engage in that process, to actively provide comments. For instance, here in South Asheville, they are taking a 2-lane road and expanding it to 4 lanes, and there's a possibility of some mitigation. This is on a roadway near the Blue Ridge Parkway. Well, there's all sorts of roads across the country. We have no shortage of highways. The roadway we're looking at now, I-40, has 26,000 vehicles a day. So, you know, plug in, engage, educate yourselves. Another thing they could do is there's a bill, hopefully, that will be reintroduced fairly soon, the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. And this bill should be reintroduced fairly soon, and advocate for passage of that bill or any local or state legislation to provide funding and mechanisms for wildlife mitigation. A lot of work is done at the state level. You know, get involved. And lastly, just support conservation groups. You know, all the conservation groups that are working on issues like this across the country. We're nonprofit, you know, we're member supported, and that's how we can do our work.
Here's a related question. What do you see as the challenges for implementing, you know, future mitigation if it's wildlife crossings, et cetera?
Sure. 26,000 vehicles per day. That's the big challenge. You know, the DOTs, their primary objective is to move goods and people safely. And so any project that slows down traffic in this busy corridor is going to be, you know, an issue we need to overcome. But the DOTs are also tasked with making sure that there are 0 fatalities on their roadways. There hasn't been a fatality in this area at this point in time, thankfully. Hopefully it'll remain that way, but the elk herd is growing and expanding. A bull elk can run 1,000 pounds, and you know, there are over 200 fatalities annually across North America with wildlife vehicle collisions. So we're trying to be proactive about this.
Great. Is NPCA undertaking similar efforts elsewhere in the country, or in getting these partners together?
Yes, in our Northern Rockies office. We have an office in Bozeman, Montana. Some of our staff members are doing some work in Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, where we have, you know, large herds of mule deer and elk, where we have grizzly bear, pronghorn antelope. So that work is active out in that office. I'm not aware of any other work that's being done in the eastern United States. You know, a lot of this sort of mitigation work gets done out west because you have, you know, elk herds that are migratory, that are moving seasonally. And as the West builds out, you're seeing more and more conflict. So it's a lot of people are excited that I talk to about seeing this kind of work being done in the eastern United States, here in the mountains in North Carolina and Tennessee.
Here's an interesting question. Can you speak to how I-40 is a wildlife barrier to movement? You know, how does that road impact wildlife movement?
That's a great question, and I didn't address that in my presentation, and so I'm really glad that someone raised this point. So I showed a dead bear. I showed some bears successfully crossing the road. You know, some animals will try to cross the road and succeed. Others will try and fail. Others will never try. They'll approach the road, and I've actually seen collar data where you see a bear come out of the park and right up to the roadway, follow the roadway, parallel it for a good distance, turn around, and head back into the park. The road is a barrier, and it's difficult to quantify the extent of that barrier, but clearly between noise and lights, you know, some animals will not try to cross it. So as our climate warms, what we're seeing is that wildlife is going to need to move. A lot of wildlife is moving towards the poles. And if you look at the Southern Appalachians, it's a huge corridor for wildlife. And I-40 is smack dab in the middle of it. So creating, improving landscape connectivity so that wildlife can move as our climate warms is vitally important for populations in the future. And not just the charismatic animals that we're focusing on. Our focal species, by the way, in addition to black bear, elk, are white-tailed deer. But a whole variety of species beyond those three could benefit if we're successful in improving permeability on this I-40 corridor.
Are elk herds near I-40 growing slower than other eastern herds that have been been reintroduced because of wildlife pollution?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question, but I can say this: there is a project that's being it's a 5-year research project that's being run out of the University of Tennessee to actually try to get a better handle on the size of the elk herd. It's estimated at about 150 animals. A new DNA technology is being utilized, and students are out collecting scat. And hopefully, we'll have a better understanding of the size of the elk herd in coming years as the findings of this research is completed. So I really don't have an answer for that. And I don't think the land managers really know. They certainly don't know exactly how many animals are on the landscape. They have an idea, but this is, you know, it's a closed canopy forest, and it's really hard to estimate population sizes.
Right. How can we suggest corridors be built in other areas of western North Carolina? I-26 had an increased number of bear fatalities.
That's a great question, and I live not far from I-26, and I travel I-26 to get to work. I was on deadline to write an article for our newsletter, and the day I was on deadline heading to work, I nearly hit a white-tailed deer. It ran out in front of me, slid, face planted in the roadway, and somehow managed to get up and scamper off the road. One of the challenges we have in this geographic area is that it's a fairly inexpensive area to live compared to the northeastern United States where I grew up. So we have a lot of retirees moving down here. So we have a lot of development and a lot of added congestion on our roadways. So we also have a black bear population that's growing. So at the same time, our residential population, our human population is growing, the bear population is growing, and the result is going to be more collisions. So I would love to see something done on I-26, but right now we don't really have the capacity to work on that. So we're focusing on I-40. There are folks in the community who are very much concerned about that issue, and on other roadways as well.
Are state wildlife agencies involved and supportive of finding solutions for these for wildlife fatalities near the park?
Absolutely. They're invaluable partners. The North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission is involved. Their staff members. Brad Stanback is a commissioner on the council. In our project area, he's hands-on involved. The Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency across the border is also involved. Not as much to the degree as North Carolina, because the issues with elk aren't as significant in Tennessee as they are in North Carolina. and our project area is more than twice the size of North Carolina as Tennessee. But yes, they're both involved, and Steve and Liz, our wildlife biologists, field researchers, are working hand in hand with them.
All right, here's another question. Is the Park Service, to the best of your knowledge anyway, are they involved, is the park involved with requiring tracts of land like Stevens Creek, like the Stevens Creek tract, or is that more the role of nonprofits?
So the Stevens Creek tract is privately owned by a land trust right now, and they don't have the Park Service does a great job. They're underfunded, they're understaffed. I mean, $11+ billion deferred maintenance backlog. The Park Service has its hands full within the boundaries of the park. I am so grateful that they are expending some resources, mostly in the form of staff time, to work with us outside the park boundary on this issue. But in terms of, protecting land outside the boundaries of the park, that work couldn't get done without conservation organizations like the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy and other groups coming together looking for solutions.
Great. Do you find that I-40 is more of a detrimental barrier because it affects on migration in light of climate change, or is it affecting the genetic health of the species within the wildlife corridor?
So my understanding is that we don't have any genetic bottlenecks in this area. The black bear are doing just fine. The Wildlife Resource Commission would like to see the population stabilize a little bit. It's growing. Right now we have a lot of conflict in the city of Asheville. We have an urban bear population in Asheville and lots of conflict with residential folks. I'm not sure about the elk. This research project that's trying to get a handle on the population size should tell the tale, but I'm not aware of any genetic bottlenecks. Was there a second part of that question that I missed, Ryan?
Let's see. Yeah, I-40 is more of a detrimental barrier because of its effects on migration in light of climate change, or is it affecting genetic health? So yeah, climate change. Do you see that playing a role?
Absolutely. I don't know how climate is going to affect our mast production moving forward. How is the health of the acorn crop going to do as a result of climate? Last year we had an incredibly rainy year, and I've heard some say that's the reason why acorns did poorly. I don't. That's anecdotal. I frankly don't know if that's the reason. But there is a lot of concern. There's a lot of uncertainty. And let me emphasize that there are some values at play here. So you have wildlife conservation, you have safety, you have cultural values as well, whether you're talking about bear hunters who value the bears, or the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians who find bears to be sacred, or other cultural values at stake. But there's a fourth value here, and that's the economic value of these wildlife, these animals. Adjacent communities to the park are dependent upon tourism for their lifeblood, for their economies. So what is a black bear or an elk worth to the local economy? You don't often, sometimes you'll see economic data quantified in terms of crash data. What is the cost of a collision with a vehicle and an elk, or a white-tailed deer, or a black bear? Well, what is the loss to the local economy when you lose an elk to a wildlife vehicle collision? So I just wanted to share that there's more at play here than just safety and wildlife conservation issues. It's a pretty complex issue.
Great. And real quick, folks, we're going to wrap up here shortly, but I entered into the chat box registration links for our next webinar on, let's see, let me go up here. April 17 at 3 o'clock, and the Trust for Public Land will be presenting. And then also, it's kind of a part two, really, to Jeff's presentation today. We're going to have some folks with the Federal Highway Administration talking about the Ecological Initiative, and that's taking an ecosystem approach to developing infrastructure projects like roads. So actually on that, Jeff, do you want to, how does this project kind of fit into that ecological initiative?
Sure. So I reached out to Federal Highways because this is a interstate highway and it involves Tennessee and North Carolina. So Federal Highways, really they helped us first and foremost as facilitators and conveners, bringing folks together. That's what my role is primarily, is a facilitator and a convener. I'm not a wildlife biologist. I'm not a land manager. I bring people together and look for common ground and common solutions. And their expertise at understanding how departments of transportation plan, how they speak, how they communicate, their jargon. Ecological was really beneficial in bringing together the wildlife biology community. Those folks work in probability often, and engineers from the DOTs, those folks work in certainty. And so sometimes they talk past one another. And Ecological really helped to bridge some of those chasms between organizational priorities and bring people together and get them talking and sitting around maps and looking for solutions. So they're valuable partners.
Great. Well, we're lucky to have, we thank you, Jeff, for all your work helping the park wildlife, or the wildlife in general that are going in and out of the park down there. And yeah, this ecological initiative is really exciting too. So there's a lot to learn with all of these efforts relating to wildlife connectivity and protecting and conserving park resources. So thanks again, Jeff, for kind of initiating or reinitiating this conversation for 2019. We've had, as folks may recall, we've had a couple of webinars, I think, looking at roads, and its effect on park resources, mostly wildlife. But it's a big issue, obviously. So yeah, more to come on this. So
Brian,
Jeff, yeah.
If I could encourage folks, I don't know if my slide is still up with my contact information, but if people want to contact me, by all means, please do so. My phone number, my email is there. And the last thing, I just want to follow up on a question from earlier about what can folks do. And so our federal agencies are really challenged and underfunded. And one thing that the Park Service folks can't do that I can do is encourage citizens to reach out to their congressional representatives and ask for increased funding for our national parks and for our Forest Service folks too, because they're hard-pressed to manage these important public lands with current budgets and current staffing levels. So.
Well, thanks again, Jeff. Okay. And thanks everyone for attending, and I look forward to hopefully having you all attend future webinars for the Park Service's Connected Conservation webinar series. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.